The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and gunpowder as the Marine unit trudged through the rugged terrain of the Vedeno district. It was late December 1999, and the mission was clear yet daunting. Secure height 1406, a strategic peak near the village of Harrowing. The young Marine, whose hands were already calloused from months of service, led his small platoon with a mix of determination and dread. The cold bit into their bones, but the weight of their rifles and the memory of fallen comrades kept them moving. As they ascended, the silence was broken only by the crunch of boots on frost-covered ground and the occasional distant echo of artillery. They had been warned of enemy forces, Basayev's fighters, entrenched on the heights, but the promise of a swift victory fueled their resolve. Little did they know, the battle ahead would test their limits in ways they couldn't yet fathom. Sergei Ivanov, the young Marine at the front, had enlisted barely a year ago, fresh from the conscription office in Moscow. At 21, he was no stranger to hardship. Growing up in a crumbling Soviet-era apartment block had toughened him early. But nothing had prepared him for the raw, unrelenting chill of the North Caucasus mountains. His breath came in ragged clouds, mingling with the fog that clung to the valleys like a shroud. The platoon, a ragtag group of 20 men from the 45th Guard Spetsnaz Regiment, moved in a loose formation, their Kalashnikovs slung low, packs heavy with ammunition, grenades, and the meager rations that passed for sustenance in this godforsaken war. Vedeno, once a sleepy mountain town, now lay behind them, its streets scarred by recent skirmishes, the air still humming with the aftermath of Russian airstrikes that had flattened suspected rebel hideouts. The Second Chechen War had erupted, just months earlier, sparked by incursions into Dagestan and a series of apartment bombings in Russia that the Kremlin blamed squarely on Chechen separatists. President Yeltsin, his health failing and his grip on power slipping, had unleashed the full might of the Russian military to crush the rebellion once and for all. Grozny, the rebel capital, was under siege, pounded into rubble by artillery and Su-25 jets, but here in the southern highlands the fight was turning guerrilla. Heights like 1406 weren't just elevations. They were choke points, vantage points from which fighters loyal to Shamil Basayev and the shadowy Ibn al-Khattab could rain fire on federal convoys snaking up from the plains. Controlling them meant denying the mujahideen their escape routes to the mountains, where they could regroup and strike again. Sergei's mind wandered as they climbed, the incline steepening into a jagged scramble over loose shale and frozen scrub. He thought of home, of his mother's babushka-wrapped parcels of black bread and pickled cabbage that never made it past the front lines, intercepted by corrupt quartermasters. Letters from his sister arrived sporadically, filled with news of ration lines and black market prices soaring higher than the peaks around him. "Stay safe, brother," she wrote. "The radio says victory is near." Victory. The word tasted bitter, like the metallic tang of fear on his tongue. He'd seen enough to know it was a lie peddled by generals safe in their Moscow dakas. Just last week, in a skirmish near the Argun River, he'd lost his first friend, young Private Kuznetsov, got shot by a sniper hidden in the tree line. Kuznetsov's eyes had gone wide, pleading, as Sergei pressed a bandage to the wound, but the blood kept coming, warm and insistent, soaking through the wool of his uniform. The platoon paused at a narrow ledge, the wind whipping through the pass like a vengeful spirit. Lieutenant Petrov, a wiry veteran with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow from the First Chechen War, barked orders in a low voice. "Eyes sharp, comrades. Basayev's dogs could be anywhere. Remember Ulis Kurt? Those heights? Cost us dearly last month." Whispers rippled through the ranks. Ulis Kurt was fresh in their memories. A bloody affair where paratroopers from the 76th Airborne had been ambushed, their positions overrun in a hail of RPGs and automatic fire. Official reports spoke of heroic stands, but the rumors filtering back from field hospitals painted a grimmer picture. Friendly fire from Russian artillery, commanders abandoning posts, bodies left to freeze on the slopes. Sergei adjusted his helmet, the liner chafing against his buzzed scalp, and checked his AK-74 for the umpteenth time. The magazine was full, the safety off, ready for the ghosts of Chechnya. As they pressed on, the terrain grew more treacherous. The path narrowed to a goat track, flanked by sheer drops into mist-shrouded ravines. Frost clung to every rock, turning the ground into a treacherous sheet of ice. One man, Corporal Dmitri, slipped and caught himself on a thorn bush, cursing under his breath as blood welled from gashes on his palms. "Easy there," Sergei muttered, helping him up. Dmitri was the joker of the platoon, always with a crude quip to lighten the mood, but today his face was pale, eyes hollow. "This place is cursed, Seryoga," he whispered. "Heard the locals call. It the devil's backbone. Mujahideen use it to slip through like shadows." Sergei nodded, saying nothing. He believed in curses now, after watching a mine claim the legs of a scout from another unit. The explosion so sudden it seemed like the earth itself had rebelled. The distant artillery grew louder, a rhythmic thunder that vibrated through their boots. It was their own guns, shelling suspected positions ahead. But in these mountains, sound played tricks. Echoes bounced off the cliffs, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. Sergei strained his ears, half expecting the chatter of Chechen AKs or the whoosh of a Grad rocket. Basayev's fighters were infamous, battle-hardened, fanatical, often bolstered by Arab mercenaries with Saudi funding and Wahhabi zeal. They'd fought the Soviets to a standstill in Afghanistan, and now they turned that savagery on Russia's sons. Intelligence briefings had warned of tunnels, booby-trapped paths, and snipers who could pick off a man at 500 meters. "They're ghosts," the briefing officer had said, "but ghosts bleed." Halfway up the ascent, the platoon encountered the first sign of recent violence. A burned-out UAZ jeep, its chassis twisted like a discarded toy, tires melted into the mud. Bullet holes pocked the doors, and a dark stain, blood, long since, frozen, crusted the ground. "Ambush site," Petrov grunted, signaling for cover. They fanned out, weapons raised, scanning the ridgeline above. Sergei crouched behind a boulder, heart pounding, finger hovering over the trigger. Minutes stretched into eternity, the only sound their labored breathing and the wind's mournful howl. Nothing. No shots, no movement. Just the eerie quiet of the aftermath. "Move out," Petrov finally ordered. As they passed the wreck, Sergei glimpsed something inside, a helmet emblazoned with the blue beret insignia of the VDV, the elite airborne troops, paratroopers, like the ones who'd bled out at Height 776 earlier that year, though that was still months away in the fog of war's timeline. No, this was December. The push south intensifying after Grozny's fall seemed imminent, but the parallels haunted him, isolated units, cut off, fighting for every meter of rocky ground. He averted his eyes, focusing on the climb. The air thinned, making each breath a labored gasp. Frostbite nipped at their extremities. Sergei's toes, numb inside his boots, ached with a dull fire. Conversation, when it came, was sparse and laced with gallows humor. "Think we'll get hot tea at the top?" Dmitri joked, his voice strained. "Or just more of that swill from the canteen?" Laughter, thin and forced, echoed briefly. Another man, Private Volkov, a farm boy from the Urals, muttered about his girl back home. "She sent a photo last week, said she'd wait." Sergei envied him that anchor, that sliver of normalcy. His own life felt suspended, a threadbare existence, of patrols and firefights. The calluses on his hands weren't just from rifles. They were from digging shallow graves in frozen soil, from bandaging wounds that wouldn't heal. As the peak loomed closer, the fog lifted slightly, revealing the skeletal outlines of pine trees bent by relentless winds. Height 1406 rose like a sentinel, its summit crowned by jagged rocks that could hide 100 men. Petrov halted them again, pulling out a crumpled map under the beam of a red lens flashlight. "We're close. Set up a perimeter at the base. No fires. Muj might spot." "Us," Sergei volunteered for point, his dread morphing into a steely focus. The weight of leadership, however informal, pressed on him. These men looked to him now, the youngest but somehow the steadiest, since their sergeant had caught shrapnel near Charlie. The final push was brutal. Slipping on ice-slick ledges, hauling each other up sheer faces, the platoon inched upward. Sweat froze on their brows, mixing with the grime of days without proper washing. Sergei's uniform, once olive drab, was caked in mud, the fabric stiff and heavy. He thought of the promise of swift victory. The briefings in base camp, where colonels with clean boots spoke of encircling the rebels, cutting off their supply lines from Vedeno to the border. Basayev, the one-legged Chechen warlord, was said to be in the area, his forces swollen with volunteers after the Dagestan raid. Capturing 1406 would block their retreat, force them into the open where Russian Mi-24 Hind helicopters could reap a harvest of steel and fire. But doubt gnawed at Sergei. The war felt endless, a meat grinder devouring young lives for political points. Yeltsin was out, Putin in, rumors swirled of a new iron fist. But what did that mean for them? The grunts freezing on these heights. A distant explosion rocked the valley below, illuminating the sky in a B. By dawn on December 31st, the Marines had taken height 1406 without resistance, a hollow victory that soon turned grim. The platoon, led by Lieutenant Yuri Kuryagin, had barely settled into the captured trenches when the enemy struck. Bullets rained down from the neighboring Gizhcheny height, and a sharp cry signaled Kuryagin's wounding. The Marines fought back with mortars, their faces streaked with mud and sweat, but the enemy's numbers overwhelmed them. Hours blurred into chaos, explosions, shouts, and the relentless push of survival. The Marine, now crouched in the dirt, watched as his comrades fell one by one. 12 of his brothers in arms lay still by the end, their blood soaking into the frozen ground. Exhausted and grieving, he clung to his weapon, the weight of their sacrifice etched into his every breath. Sergei Ivanov peered over the lip of the trench, his eyes burning from the acrid smoke that hung in the pre-dawn air like a funeral veil. The summit of height 1406 was theirs, but it felt more like a trap than a triumph. The abandoned positions, shallow foxholes lined with empty shell casings and discarded prayer rugs, spoke of a hasty retreat by the mujahideen, but Sergei knew better than to trust the quiet. The platoon had crested the peak, just as the first gray light of morning bled across the horizon, their boots crunching over frost-rimed rocks. Lieutenant Kuryagin, a stern man in his early 30s, with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow and eyes that had seen too much in the First War, had clapped Sergei on the shoulder. "Good work, Ivanov. Secure the perimeter. We'll radio for reinforcements and hold till New Year's." New Year's. The word hung absurdly in the freezing air, a reminder of celebrations back home, champagne toasts and fireworks, while here, the only bursts would be from grenades. They'd spread out quickly, digging in with entrenching tools that barely scratched the frozen earth. The wind howled through the pass, carrying the faint metallic tang of distant artillery from the siege of Grozny, now raging far to the north. Vedeno lay below them like a shadowed scar on the landscape, its minarets silhouetted against the paling sky. Sergei had checked his gear. Extra magazines for the AK-74, a couple of F1 grenades clipped to his belt, and the RGD-5 in his pocket, its pin a cold comfort against his thigh. Dmitri, the corporal from earlier, had joked about sharing a cigarette to celebrate, but Petrov shut him down. "Save your breath for fighting, fool. Basayev's ghosts don't celebrate holidays." Shamil Basayev, the name alone sent a chill deeper than the frost. The one-legged terrorist mastermind, architect of the Budyonovsk hospital siege and the Dagestan incursion that had reignited this hellish war. Intelligence whispered he was in these mountains, his forces a hydra of Chechen nationalists and foreign jihadists funded by shadowy Gulf patrons. The first sign of trouble came not with a bang, but a whistle, a mortar round slicing the air from the direction of Gizhcheny, the adjacent height looming like a watchful sentinel just a kilometer away. It detonated short, showering the platoon with shrapnel that pinged off rocks like deadly hail. "Incoming!" Petrov bellowed, but it was too late for composure. Sergei dove into his foxhole, heart slamming against his ribs as the ground erupted in a symphony of explosions. The mujahideen had been waiting, hidden in the folds of the terrain, their positions zeroed in by spotters who'd evaded the initial sweep. Bullets began to crack overhead, the high-pitched zip of AK fire mingling with the deeper cough of PK machine guns. From Gisheni, shadows moved, dozens, maybe hundreds, silhouetted against the rising sun, their beards and packholes unmistakable. Even at this distance, Kuryagin was on the radio, his voice steady but urgent, calling for support from the artillery batteries back in Vedeno. "Fire mission. Coordinates 42. Something. Gisheni Ridge. Adjust fire." But the line crackled with static, the mountains swallowing signals like they did men's lives. Then came the sharp cry, a guttural "ah!" that cut through the din. Sergei whipped his head around to see the lieutenant slump against the trench wall, clutching his side. Blood bloomed dark through his telnyashka undershirt, the striped sailor's top that marked them as elite. "I'm hit! Keep firing!" Kuryagin gasped, his face paling as he fumbled for a field dressing. Sergei scrambled over, pressing a wad of gauze to the wound, but the bullet had torn through muscle and nicked something vital. Warm blood seeped between his gloved fingers. "Hold on, sir! Medic!" But there was no medic left. Their corpsman had twisted an ankle on the ascent and been left behind with a rear guard. Chaos erupted in earnest. The platoon returned fire, their RPK light machine guns chattering from the flanks, tracers arcing like fiery comets toward the enemy height. Mortar teams, Dmitri among them, hauled the 82mm tubes into position, dropping rounds that whooshed skyward before crashing down in geysers of earth and rock on Gisheni. But the mujahideen were relentless, their assault a wave of disciplined fury. RPG-7s streaked from concealed positions, the backblast blooming orange as warheads slammed into the slope below the summit. One detonated close, hurling Private Volkov backward like a ragdoll. He landed twisted, his leg mangled, screams piercing the gunfire. "Man down! Suppress that launcher!" Petrov roared, his own rifle barking in short bursts. Sergei fired blindly over the parapet, the recoil jarring his shoulder, the brass casings hot against his boots. Sweat stung his eyes, mixing with the mud, caked on his face from the night's climb, turning to gritty paste. Hours blurred into a nightmare of survival. The sun climbed higher, mocking them with its weak winter light, illuminating the dead and dying. The enemy pressed from multiple angles, now flanking from the eastern ravine, where Chechen snipers picked off anyone who raised their head. Sergei saw his first comrade fall. Young Private Kuznetsov. No, wait, that was the river fight. This was Timofeyev, the kid from Siberia with the tattoo of a bear on his forearm. A bullet caught him in the throat as he reloaded, spraying arterial, blood across the trench like crimson rain. Sergei dragged him down, but the light in his eyes flickered out before he could even whisper a prayer. "Bastards!" Dmitri yelled, lobbing a grenade that exploded in a puff of smoke on the slope, buying them seconds. But the cost mounted. Another RPG hit the mortar position. Sergei heard the blast, then Dmitri's voice cut short in a wet gurgle. He risked a glance. His friend lay crumpled, chest caved in, the tube twisted beside him like a broken limb. The platoon shrank under the onslaught. 12 men now, down from 20, their calls for air support unanswered as Mi-24s were tied, up pounding Grozny's ruins. Friendly artillery finally spoke, shells whistling overhead to crater Gisheni, but too many fell short. Friendly fire, the eternal curse of these mountains. One round detonated 50 meters behind their lines, shredding 2 more Marines in, a fountain of dirt and limbs. Kuryagin, bandaged but fading, ordered a counterattack. "Fix bayonets! Push the left flank!" Sergei charged with a handful of others, leaping from cover in a desperate bayonet rush, screaming to drown the fear. They gained 10 meters, stabbing at shadows in the rocks, but the mujahideen melted away, only to reappear with enfilading fire. Bullets whined past Sergei's ear, one grazing his helmet with a metallic tang. He dropped, firing until his magazine clicked empty, then clawing for another with mud-slick hands. The air thickened with cordite and the coppery reek of blood. Shouts in Russian mingled with ululating cries in Chechen and Arabic. The foreign fighters, Wahhabis with their black turbans and fanatic gleam, pouring lead from elevated perches. Sergei watched as Corporal Ivanenko, the platoon's grenadier, took a round to the knee. He collapsed howling, only to be silenced by a follow-up burst to the chest. The ground grew slick with gore, boots sliding in the frozen slurry. Petrov, ever the rock, manned a machine gun nest, his bursts mowing down a cluster of attackers scrambling up the incline. "For the motherland!" he bellowed. But a sniper's bullet found him through the scope, exploding the back of his skull in a pink. Missed. Sergei avenged him with a burst that felled the shooter, but the victory was Pyrrhic. Another comrade, the wiry Tatar recruit named Ruslan, clutched at a gut wound, whispering, "Tell my wife, I love," before going still. By midday, the fight devolved into a brutal stalemate. The Marines held the summit by inches, their ammunition dwindling to precious rounds. Sergei crouched in the dirt of his foxhole, the world reduced to the thunder of explosions and the ragged gasps of the wounded. Kuryagin had passed out from blood loss, his breathing shallow. Volkov whimpered nearby. Leg crept in. This was no swift victory, but a slaughter. The cold seeped back, numbing his fingers around the rifle grip, the memory of fallen comrades a leaden weight. Timofeyev's blank stare, Dmitri's broken form, Petrov's brains on the snow. As the sun dipped toward afternoon, a lull fell, broken only by sporadic sniping. Sergei reloaded his last magazine, ears ringing, body aching from the ceaseless tension. 12 brothers gone, their blood freezing into dark pools that the wind scoured clean. He clung to his weapon like a lifeline, the Kalashnikov's scarred, stark a testament to the madness. Exhaustion clawed at him, grief a hollow in his chest, but survival demanded vigilance. The battle for height 1406. As the fog of war lifted, the surviving Marine sat slumped, his gloved hands trembling against the cold earth. The battle for height 1406 had ended, but the cost lingered in the air. Around him, the few remaining soldiers shared silent glances, their eyes reflecting the same mix of relief and sorrow. Medals would come later, for courage, but they felt like hollow tokens against the memory of lost friends. Years later, those memories would haunt him, the faces of the fallen, the sound of gunfire, the bitter cold of that New Year's Eve. Yet amid the pain, there was a quiet pride in having endured. The height had been held, but the true victory was in the stories he carried forward, a testament to the resilience of those who survived the brutal fight for height 1406. Sergei Ivanov slumped deeper into the frozen mud of the trench, his body, a map of bruises and exhaustion, the Kalashnikov across his lap like a faithful but burdensome companion. The sun had dipped low behind the jagged peaks of the Caucasus, painting the sky in bruised purples and fading oranges, but the light offered no warmth. The gunfire had sputtered to a halt hours ago, the last echoes chased away by the wind that scoured the summit like an indifferent janitor. Gishcheny Height stood silent now, its slopes pocked with craters from the belated Russian artillery barrage that had finally silenced the mujahideen. Reinforcements, a ragged company from the 160th Tank Regiment, had clattered up the trail in BMPs just before dusk, their diesel engines a guttural roar that shattered the post-battle hush. But for Sergei and the handful of survivors, the arrival felt like an afterthought, a mechanical salvation too late to matter. He lifted his head slowly, the effort pulling at muscles knotted from hours of tension. Around him, the remnants of the platoon stirred like ghosts in the gathering twilight. Only 8 left, including himself. 8 from the 20 who had crested this cursed peak at dawn. Kuryagin, the lieutenant, had been medevaced out on a Mi-8 helicopter that had touched down amid swirling snow flurries, his face ashen under the morphine haze, whispering orders even as the rotors whipped the air. Volkov, the farm boy with the mangled leg, had gone with him, his whimpers fading into the thump of blades. The others, the dead, lay covered in blood-stiffened ponchos, their forms outlined in the dim light like forgotten statues. Timofeyev's wide eyes still stared blankly at the clouds, Dmitri's hand frozen in a perpetual half-grip on an imaginary grenade, Petrov's headless silhouette a stark reminder of the sniper's precision. Sergei had helped stack the bodies, his gloved hands numb, not just from cold but from the surreal detachment that follows atrocity. "We'll bury them proper come morning," the new commander, a major with a fresh shave and eyes that avoided the carnage, had said. But Sergei knew the truth. Shallow graves in the permafrost, dog tags pocketed, and a hurried report back to base. The survivors gathered in a loose circle near a sputtering signal fire. The major had relented, deeming the risk low now that the heights were secured. Faces streaked with grime and frostbite's early blush reflected the fire's glow, eyes hollowed by the day's slaughter. There was Ruslan's cousin, the Tatar kid who'd survived a gut shot only to lose his brother in the same burst. He sat cross-legged, sharpening his bayonet with mechanical rhythm, tears carving clean tracks down his cheeks. Beside him, Private Sokolov, a lanky Muscovite who'd joined for the pay to support his ailing mother, clutched a crumpled photo of her, whispering half-formed prayers in the Orthodox style. And then there was Lena. No, not a soldier, but the memory of her letter in Sergei's pack, the one he'd read a dozen times on the march up. She was back in Moscow, a typist in some drab office, dreaming of a life beyond ration cards and blackouts. "Come home soon, Seryoja," she'd written. "The war can't last forever. If only." Silent glances passed between them, heavy with unspoken questions. How had it gone so wrong? The briefings had painted this as a mop-up operation, Basayev's forces routed after the fall of Grozny. But the mujahideen had been waiting. Their ambush a testament to the war's guerrilla soul, hit hard, fade away, bleed the bear dry. Sergei met Sokolov's gaze, and in that moment, a flicker of shared sorrow passed. The loss not just of brothers, but of innocence, of the boyish faith that medals and glory awaited. Relief was there too, a fragile thing, born of the simple fact that they breathed while others did not. The major passed around a flask of samagon, the homemade vodka burning like liquid fire down Sergei's throat, chasing away the chill if not the ghosts. "To the fallen," the major toasted, his voice gruff. They drank in silence, the fire crackling, like distant small arms. As night fully cloaked the heights, the wind picked up, moaning through the pines like the wail of Chechen widows. Sergei wrapped himself in his greatcoat, the wool stiff with dried mud and blood not his own. Sleep came in fits, haunted by dreams of the assault. The whistle of RPGs, the wet smack of bullets finding flesh. Dmitri's final joke cut short. He woke sweating despite the cold, heart racing, only to remember it was real. The others fared no better, muttered curses in the dark, the scrape of boots as someone paced the perimeter. Dawn brought a meager breakfast of tinned stew heated over the fire, the meat stringy and tasteless, but it filled the void. Burial details were assigned. Sergei dug with the others, the entrenching tool ringing against frozen ground like a death knell. They lowered the 12 into the earth, a hasty orthodox rite recited by Sokolov, crosses fashioned from rifle slings and branches. "Eternal memory," he intoned, and Sergei echoed it, the words tasting of ash. Word came down from command. Via crackling radio, the heights held, the push south continued. Basayev had slipped away, they said, toward the Georgian border, but 1406 was a linchpin, denying the rebels their overlook. Medals would follow. For courage, the Order of the Red Star for Kuryagin. If he pulled through, lesser honors for the rest. Sergei snorted inwardly at the thought. Tokens, yes. Polished brass to pin on uniforms riddled with holes, handed out in some Moscow ceremony while families wept in provincial graveyards. He'd seen it before. The parade ground heroes, safe from the mud, doling out ribbons for spilled blood. But even as cynicism gnawed, a quiet pride stirred. They'd held. Against odds that should have broken them, they'd clung to this rock in the sky, denying the enemy their ground. It wasn't glory, but it was something. Resilience forged in fire, the stubborn Russian will that had weathered worse. The platoon, what was left, began the descent the next day, the trail slick with melting snow from a brief thaw. BMPs waited. Below, engines idling, offering a brief respite from the march. Sergei rode in silence, the vehicle's sway lulling him into a stupor. Vedeno greeted them with wary stares from locals, Chechens bundled in wool, their eyes hard with resentment, whispering of Russian devils. Base camp was a hive of activity, trucks unloading ammo, medics triaging the wounded, officers barking at maps. Sergei reported to the quartermaster, handing over his spent magazines, receiving fresh ones like a ritual of renewal. A hot shower, miracle of miracles, washed away the grime, but not the memories. In the barracks that night, letters were written. Sokolov penned one to his mother, haltingly describing the skirmish without the gore. Sergei stared at blank paper, words failing him. How to explain the faces, the screams, the way death smelled? Like cordite and voided bowels. Years slipped by like pages in a forgotten diary. The war dragged into 2000, then sputtered toward an uneasy peace under Putin, the new czar with his judo grip on power. Grozny was rebuilt in glass and steel, a Potemkin facade over the ruins, but the mountains remembered. Sergei mustered out in 2001, the calluses on his hands softening as he took a job in a St. Petersburg factory, welding hulls for ships that would never see the sea. The nightmares came regular. New Year's Eve, 1999, the clock ticking toward midnight as shells fell instead of confetti. He'd wake gasping, Lena, now his wife, stirring beside him, her hand on his shoulder a anchor. "It's over, Seryozha," she'd murmur, but he knew better. The faces haunted. Timofeyev's plea, Dmitri's laugh silenced, Petrov's last roar. And the sounds, gunfire's staccato, the wind's howl mimicking Chechen war cries, the bitter cold that seeped into bones and stayed. Reunions were rare, the survivors scattering like shrapnel. Sokolov drank himself into an early grave, the medals gathering dust on his shelf. Ruslan's cousin returned to Tatarstan, farming quietly, but Sergei heard he still sharpened that bayonet every full moon. Sergei himself found solace in stories, whispered to his son over bedtime tales sanitized of blood or shared with fellow vets at dingy bars, the samagon flowing freer than tears. "We held 1406, he'd say, voice steady. Basayev's dogs came at us like wolves, but we didn't break. Pride, yes, quiet and unadorned. Not for the Kremlin spin, the parades, but for the endurance, the brotherhood forged in hell. The height had been held, a footnote in military annals, but for Sergei, it was the core of his being, a testament that in the face of oblivion, men could stand. Decades later, in the quiet of retirement, Sergei walked the parks of St. Petersburg. The Neva's flow a far cry from mountain streams. The war was history now, documentaries dissecting the counter-terrorist operation, but he carried it forward. The stories, the true ones, laced with pain and defiance, were his victory. Height. 1406.